You know what's crazy? How cringe-lennials were living through one of the best eras in video games. Classic after classic was releasing every other week, and they were just like, meh, Blow's Adventure for the NES was way better. This stuff is soulless garbage. This video is a little different. In the past, I looked at the millennial style. This one is about the generation of reviewers, the past generation who shaped the way games are now. But, Mr. Nerd, not all of these people are millennials. Yes, that's true. Not everyone I'm going to mention in this review technically belongs to the millennial generation. It's really just the easiest way to single out this time period, this past generation. And if you're a millennial, these things all apply to you. You look like this and you say and do all of these things, no exceptions. So, millennial reviewers, do they affect video games? Well, yes. Of course, the main influence on gaming is revenue. That will always be the main motivation. It is the lifeblood that keeps the industry running. Just like how the food industry is driven by money, or the mining industry is motivated by money. But money is not the sole decision-making factor in the creation of games. And the deeper you go into the nitty-gritty of game design, you can see what developers say when making game design decisions. They look at what is popular, at commercial success. They look at what game testers say. They look at public opinion. And they look at critical opinion. Critical success is a factor in game design decisions. So, with that in mind, how have critical opinions affected the current generation of video games? Well, let's take a look. If you're a gamer, especially one from one of those expensive countries, you probably feel screwed over with the price of games being what they are. The price of anything online, really. But there is another way. That's why I'm sponsored by Surfshark for this video. It's a subscription VPN with thousands of servers in hundreds of countries around the globe. Now you can buy all the video you want for 100 rupee. When I research for videos, I'm sometimes told that I can't view that in my region. With Surfshark, you can bypass regional blocks and censorship. There's also Surfshark Search, with completely hidden searches that do not retain your data, so you know Diddy isn't spying on all your personal info. So click on my affiliate link below. Visit surfshark.com/shreddednerd to get 4 extra months for free, and make sure you have the correct referral so that Diddy doesn't try to skim some money off the top. And download Surfshark today. It has a 30-day money-back guarantee. And subscribe. It glows. Does the like button also glow? So, to the examples. Remember how often reviews would include some criticism along the lines of, this game was only 6 hours, it was only 8 hours.
The single player campaign is criminally short, maybe 8 to 10 hours depending on difficulty setting and individual ham-handedness.
The criticism was essentially that the game wasn't long enough. It didn't take enough of your time. Now, it's not like there's no value to this critique. Games do make a value proposition. Considering the amount of hours of enjoyment you get for your $60 purchase isn't without merit, or more like $70 nowadays, probably $100 in the future. If you pay full price for a 3-hour game with no replayability, you might feel ripped off. But quality and quantity are obviously not identical. In the time since such criticism was widespread, what has happened? Well, Assassin's Creed happened, World of Warcraft happened, or continued to happen, Gacha happened, and we realize you can dominate all of your players' time with mindless, repetitive busywork. Collect 1,000 feathers. Collect 200 Funko Pops, and games would often pad out their runtime with boring filler missions that break the pacing. One of the most egregious examples, and one of my favorites, was there's these 2 missions right near the end of Borderlands 2 that you basically forget and basically just exist to pad out the runtime for the game right near the end, and they just break the pacing entirely. We had a massive wave of generic open world games that always slow you down with the most mind-numbing activities. Some games have even come to consist largely of the busy work, with very little actual substantial gameplay in between, like Destiny. In retrospect, those games that were basically 8 hours of all killer, no filler were a miracle. There are some shorter indie games out there that show us that games don't have to be so long. They just have to be good, be compelling. Well, it isn't just critics that cause this phenomenon. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this constant complaining about it contributed to developers trying to pad out their games. Another obvious one, to me, when talking of the snark-lennial generation, is the Disney adults of gaming, and that is the Nintendo adults. There was an entire Nintendo industrial complex on YouTube back in the day, hyping up Nintendo products endlessly. Imagine this, a guy who just makes top 10 videos all day, all night, where there's a massive intro between every entry on the list, where he edits in a couple game cutscenes or whatever. In the early days of gaming YouTube, these people were the dominant voices, and they were the voices for all of gaming. They really started review culture on YouTube. They made an art form out of it, and frankly, some of them were quite good at it. It was downstream from the previous Nintendo review culture. That is, a lot of game journalists and people who write about games were huge Nintendo evangelists, like the Mormons of gaming. One example is Banjo-Kazooie. Now, it's a fun game. It's a good game, but if you listen to YouTube reviewers for long enough, you would think it was the second 3D platformer game ever made, after Super Mario 64, of course. Banjo was well made, but it was also doing things other games are doing or had done. Nintendo is kind of like a bubble, a closed ecosystem, an echo chamber. When you're within it, you have a skewed vision of the gaming landscape and tend to view Nintendo products as bigger cultural phenomenons than they really were. There is an infamous exceit. Nintendo YouTubers would make you think that Banjo-Kazooie was a massive phenomenon, but in reality it sold about as much as Croc. It is said that the Banjo cuck kneels before the Croc Chad. GoldenEye 64 is a similar case. It didn't really achieve things that other games of the time didn't have. Non-linear objective systems? Other games did that too. Quake 2 came out around the same time. In fact, other first-person games had much deeper systems well before it came out. Not to mention that it doesn't hold up as much as other shooters from the time. Mostly due to the control scheme, which was one of the obvious downsides of the system. The fucked up controller that they forced developers and gamers to deal with. It sucks. There's no "it had soul." No, it was just nonsensical and shit. You can meme it all you want, but there will never be some ironic reassessment of this. It was silly. And it was a silly restriction that every developer who worked on the system had to work around. These man-children would also make a bold claim often. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is the best game of all time. And it's still upheld at this level by a lot of critics. Now, of course, any product that's held to this level before you go into it as a consumer is probably not going to live up to that title. Probably won't meet that expectation. And I went into Zelda aware of the cultural influence it held. All these Nintendo YouTubers held it up as the holy grail. And yeah, it's definitely not the greatest game of all time. Also, that is just my opinion. But like all the others, it is still very good. It's still very well made, and this game was certainly influential on adventure games. The lock-on, the auto-jump, the simple intuitive puzzle designs, all the dungeons are so varied. You fight all these creatures that look like they crawled out of Asmongold's room. But as for it being like the greatest ever, I actually just don't get it. Maybe you had to be there. You had to be a child growing up with this. It still doesn't make sense to me. Maybe because it's so simple and intuitive, so polished for the time. Similar appeal to, say, Portal. It's kind of why Paradox games or Factorio could never be hailed as the greatest games of all time, even though they are the greatest for some people. Having too much complexity automatically filters out enough of the audience. Action RPGs and adventure games were able to effectively hint at some of the depth that exists in RPGs without overloading the normie brain with too much information. Perhaps that's why Skyrim is also so popular. So I would say the Nintendo bonus when it comes to reviews is absolutely real. And converse to the Nintendo 64 praise was the GameCube hate. Both the GameCube and the Nintendo 64 undersold. The GameCube had obviously a much better controller, which to be fair isn't hard. It also had a good library of exclusives. Maybe it was a bit disappointing as a follow-up, maybe it wasn't as good as its competition, but it will forever be known as the Nintendo Shitcube. Well, at least every GameCube that got sold actually got played. Every single family on planet Earth bought a Wii, and that Wii is now left to collect dust on the drawers under the TV. And it's interesting how the GameCube was singled out as the console for kids, as if the Nintendo 64 and the Wii weren't for little children. Like, just look at this thing. This is the most a game console has ever looked like a toy. Jak 2 is an interesting touchstone for critics. The previous game was a solid platformer, with a very child-friendly atmosphere, like Diddy's Mansion. The sequel was a complete tonal departure, dark, edgy sci-fi. They made the formerly silent protagonist vocal, and they gave him the vocals of a Linkin Park album. And many critics panned it, a few praised it, some were indifferent. It was a strange choice indeed, but to be honest, it wasn't that crazy. It honestly worked. It was inspired by other games of the time, the Volga Wave and Limp Bizkit. Other games like Need for Speed did a similar thing. The games that it was inspired by include things like Grand Theft Auto. The previous Jak and Daxter had this kind of interconnected map structure, a bit like Banjo-Kazooie or something. It was actually kind of innovative, no loading screens to interrupt your movement, but then Jak 2 pivoted to an open world style. And to be honest, it is remembered fondly and for good reason. It actually was a fantastic game, honestly. And no, it wasn't too edgy. This is one of those rare cases where developers correctly read the room and pivoted away from bright Scrimlo-Bimblo likes into a new direction and pulled it off. The writing was witty and the characters were good. The plot was engaging, and to be honest, it still had plenty of light-hearted moments. It actually worked quite well, having characters like Daxter juxtaposed with the grim environments. Goofy characters in a goofy world are just kind of wasted, they don't really stand out. This new direction added more contrast, and it added some more depth even. Another big criticism that the game received was for the abundance of timed missions. You often had to redo missions several times due to the strict time limitation, and you had to redo them over and over, and it was challenging. Like you'd have to escort somebody to a location within like 2 minutes. Many of them made use of these hover bikes that you could find everywhere that people were driving around. And you know, this game was known for its difficulty, which is funny because I beat it as a kid and I just thought this is normal. It was only after growing up that I found out it was meant to be a very difficult game, apparently. And that's not to gas myself up as some kind of pro, I just like to be challenged. And I didn't mind repeating the same mission when I failed. That just means I wasn't good enough. In my eyes, that was just about as hard as a game should be. But I learned much later that people hated the timed missions. I thought they were great. It adds an extra intensity to games. It sets a skill floor to be able to beat the games and really tested your abilities. It didn't feel cheap to me. The plot had a reason for them to exist. They were often communicated in advance, and the times were never that long. You had to make it somewhere within 2 minutes, which really isn't that long. Like, you can repeat that, it's fine. You can't just dilly-dally around, you need to be focused and engaged. And this is a generalized issue as well. Dead Rising was built around this mechanic where there is a clock constantly ticking down, and each side quest had time limits attached to it. It added pressure to the game and again pushed you to engage with it because you had to be efficient. You had to make choices all the time, which is engaging. Because with each choice, you spent your limited amount of time that you have. I'm honestly shocked more games haven't played around with this feature because it created a really intense and rewarding gameplay loop. There are other games that have a system like this, just hidden behind abstraction, like XCOM, where time is always moving forward and the crises just keep getting worse with time, and you have to manage them and you have to choose which missions to pursue because you can't do all of them. Time is a resource, and it's basically just like any other resource management in a game. Pushes you to make decisions. Adding this other level of decision making makes the game more engaging. But critics hated it because they have to think too much. Apparently it's a massive faux pas. With Dead Rising, they actually responded to the noise and removed the time limitation altogether in one of the sequels, and it just ruined the game. Time limits. That's something you don't see as much anymore. Half-Life is another big one for critics. Many claimed Half-Life 2 was the greatest game of all time. Like with all the other examples, it's a good game, but it was gassed up to mythological status by Millennial Reviewers. Half-Life has some of the most pretentious fans of all time. They hype it up as though it was some sophisticated masterpiece. Shooters, but for intelligent people. To be fair, you have to have a very high IQ to understand Half-Life. Without a solid grasp on theoretical physics, the game will just go over your head. Oh, and it never breaks first-person perspective. But you know what it does? It makes a great argument for doing so by forcing you into these unskippable, basically cutscenes, where you just jump around the room and not do anything. Maybe the first time you're listening to the story, But what if you want to replay the game? Suddenly you're forced to go through like an hour's worth of cutscenes before you can even play it. What about these monster closets with enemies that waddle out of it one by one in a row? It's just so damn intellectual, like it's so sophisticated. I don't think I'm smart enough to get this. I'm just a console pleb. Apparently the enemy AI actually was quite intelligent and well designed, but you couldn't tell with how the levels were designed. Unsatisfying levels, pretty basic puzzles, poor vehicle physics. Like with Ocarina of Time, it does a lot of things which are individually done better by other games. There were good shooters before, at the same time, and after the release of Half-Life. Singling Half-Life out specifically as the model, as the only way shooters should be, is very much indicative of a generation of gamers. Accompanying that view is often the idea that Halo ruined shooters, and I've already talked about this. It dumbed them down by making them work for consoles. Not to pit them against each other, I've already done that, but it really isn't that deep. Both Halo 2 and Half-Life 2 were technologically complex for their time. I mean, they both used the Havoc engine for physics. Both of them had sophisticated enemy design with a number of different enemy types with varied behavior depending on so many different environmental factors. Both of them had varied encounters, level design, and visuals. They both had large and varied weapon arsenals. They were both sophisticated in terms of what mattered, the gameplay. It's only the surface level distinctions that people use to say that Halo was unsophisticated, regenerating health, 2-weapon limit, it was made for console babies. I think it definitely was a platform thing. Now that Halo is on PC, nobody seems to care anymore. That superiority complex also extended to Valve as a company. They released a lot of good games, but there was a pervasive idea that they could do no wrong at all. And honestly, this idea persists. Except they popularized loot boxes in PC gaming. They facilitated a gambling economy surrounding their games. Artifact. They're generally not as scummy as other companies, but they've made a ton of anti-consumer decisions over the years. I think one of the biggest effects of Half-Life criticisms is on the topic of first-person platforming. It was held as a maxim that first-person platforming doesn't work. There's one example that it doesn't, and many showing that it certainly can. It's not that first-person platforming doesn't work, it's that Half-Life's platforming was bad. Mirror's Edge showed that a first-person platforming game can work, but barely anyone makes these. Until indies came along decades later and showed that you're still allowed to make them. But for a while, devs were afraid to include platforming in their shooter games in any significant capacity. And you see some examples, like there's a secret mission that was in Destiny 2 called 0 Hour. Now, most Destiny content is slop, like I said, but a fraction of it is actually really cool and well designed, and this is one of the cool examples. It was cool because it had both first-person platforming and a strict time limit, and that made it so fun and intense. But you can barely make things like this because reviewers don't like actual challenge. Also, they removed this mission from the game anyway. Now it's just sitting there in the vault with all of P. Diddy's unreleased music. Another common criticism you'd hear in the millennial generation was that games were too linear and scripted. I miss when games were just moving around an abstract environment picking up keys. Why do they have stories and events happening? There were some freeform games like Thief and Deus Ex where you could basically approach each scenario in the game any way you wanted. And like some of the others, this criticism isn't entirely without merit. Like, there were some military shooters that would completely railroad you around like 2010, giving you absolutely no options. But it became a cliche. And here's the thing, many of the most beloved games are also extremely scripted and linear. Half-Life? Max Payne? I think it was about player expectations. If you see a place that looks like you should be able to go there, but you can't, that feels bad for the player. It's also about games not letting the player fail, not letting them fuck up and have to redo sections. The critique wasn't really focused enough, and now every dev wants to do some open world slop, or semi-open world slop. Both of these ideas can be very good and work in a certain context, but you really have to build it as an open world game from the ground up. And for a lot of these games that tried it, it was really more of a flop. because they were trying to mesh together conflicting styles. Like Shadow Warrior 2. It added replayable open-world light missions with a hub world and a Borderlands light weapon system, and it just ruined the experience. It was way better off as a linear level-based shooter, and I'm glad modern shooters like Doom Eternal really lean into the linear formula, because that's often the best for well-crafted multiplayer experiences. Another common thread: cover shooters bad. Heard in the context of first-person shooters, but also more so with third-person shooters, especially with Gears of War. Like the other critiques, there was a phenomenon that gave rise to this critique. It was a bit saturated, but it was never really that bad. Like, you were never really forced to play them. There was never a point where third-person chest-high wall cover shooters were completely unavoidable. And there were many good games in the genre. Overall, I just feel this trend was mostly avoidable, with a few standout shockers like Kane and Lynch. But here's the thing, every shooter has cover. Just taking aim at the idea of cover altogether, just broadly writing it off. Saying a game forces you to take cover is a bad thing. Every shooter is built around cover to some degree. It is a basic element of shooters, and emphasizing it more in some games has produced some of the most unique and interesting gameplay interactions we've seen. Like tactical shooters as an entire genre. They're basically cover-based shooters. And with the chest-high walls dotted around the map in third-person shooters, there are a lot of similar game contrivances that you'll notice when you pay attention. To be fair, this specific one is more noticeable. Isn't it great that there aren't as many games like this now? They haven't disappeared. I mean, every third-person game still has the obligatory, leaning against the wall mechanic, but it's basically useless in many of them now. They just include it because they have to. I think the gameplay in these cover-based third-person shooters is orders of magnitude better than the generic Grand Theft Auto style. It has, actual combat with actual enemies that have actual strategy, rather than just go here, point at guys, click to shoot them, and that's it. Another thing that these third-person chest-high wall military style shooters had was so-called tacked-on multiplayer. It wasn't just those that had this feature either. It would often happen in first-person shooters as well, and even some platformer games. This is basically where developers would create a largely single-player game, but then also include a multiplayer side mode as well, which was clearly intended to be secondary in the experience. There are some bad examples like BioShock 2. It was just kind of unnecessary there. But also, basically every good multiplayer game started out as tacked-on multiplayer. Call of Duty, Halo, Rainbow Six, at least the classics. Maybe newer games just aren't like that anymore. Seems there's a lot more multiplayer-only games now that people are playing. But in a lot of those classics, they were basically modes that were added at the last minute, using significantly fewer development resources than the campaign. Now, I disagree with this tacked-on multiplayer critiques, because these multiplayer modes felt the opposite of cynical. They very often felt to me like something the developers pushed to add into their game out of love, because they wanted to provide the best value to the customer. Not to mention, not every part of a game dev team is firing on all cylinders at all times. The design needs to be done before the art. They can't be done synchronously. So if the devs have extra unutilized time, why not try to add something for the fans? Why not create multiplayer maps that reuse campaign assets? Ubisoft used to add cool multiplayer modes like Spies vs Mercs or the Assassin's Creed multiplayer. They were an interesting and fun experience, and who cares if it dies out eventually? Around launch, you get to have a new and interesting experience, and the single player game is still there to play if you buy the game a lot later. And if you really want to try out the multiplayer, you can get some of your friends together to try and run a lobby. And I'm sad this is kind of gone for the most part. I think about how fun Doom 2016 multiplayer was, but they never tried to expand on it. They just cut it in Eternal and had battle mode instead. I also can't go without mentioning the obsession reviewers have basically always had with Sonic. Every single video reviewer from a certain era had to mention Sonic 06 in some capacity. It was so overplayed. There was always some gag about how it was pure evil or something, basically just exaggerating it to the level of worst game ever. There are obviously worse games. Some people went as far as to say Sonic was never good. I'm not even a Sonic fan, but obviously there have been good Sonic games. There have also been good 3D Sonic games. Sure, they made plenty of stinkers, but Sonic hate feels very much like something of a certain generation. Now I want to do a rapid fire round. Point out some other cliches. One is the dude bro shooter. I went back and looked, and depending on how broad you set your net, it was never really that much of a thing. There weren't that many games around, and many of the archetypical dude bro games were, well, good. It feels like the precursor to Gamergate and the toxic masculinity discourse more than anything. To some, the dude bro games were basically just any game that featured a bald, white male character as the protagonist, and that was enough to get it labeled dude bro, or just having anything vaguely gritty. Another cliche, Crysis is a tech demo. Crysis 1 was actually quite fun. It had the same freeform gameplay style of Far Cry. It had a variety of vehicles, environments, etc. It felt like it was a fun sandbox game, and it just happened to be pretty on top of that. So I just think calling it a tech demo was just a silly cliche. What about cell shading hides bad graphics? And this is such a millennial coded position, because nowadays the consensus is, rightly, that art direction trumps graphical fidelity and realism any day of the week. And cell shading works if that's what the game is going for. I think this cliche comes, again, from centering the importance of Nintendo and Zelda in the gaming landscape, because so much of it seems to extend from the backlash which Wind Waker received. And I don't even remember hearing about this one back in the day, but I've been told by a few people now that apparently some people thought Fear had weak level design. When I was told about this, I was a bit baffled. I mean, it had great AI, and the objective of level design in this type of game should ultimately be to make the best use of that great AI, to give it interesting interactions. Because Lord knows there's some games that do not make good use of their AI. And Fear level design does make good use of its AI. It gives them interesting interactions, and cool things happen. I will agree that it could be more varied. But obviously they had budget constraints. The level and encounter design and, yes, scripting was excellent for the most part. So what are some of the examples that you remember best? Reviewer cliches, how reviewers affected games? Let me know in the comments. Support me on Patreon, like, subscribe, thanks for watching, goodbye.